Good morning, class. So today I am going to present to you my literature review presentation. So just to kind of recap where we are, you've chosen a topic. You have gathered around 10 articles related to your topic, and now we're going to put those, really the conclusions of all of those papers together to draw some general conclusions about our topic. Okay. So as I go through this presentation, I'm going to kind of give it to you like if I was just teaching it, but I'm also going to then step aside real quick and point out some things structurally about my presentation to kind of give you some hints and tips about how you should set yours up. Okay. So the title of my presentation is High Intensity Interval Training. What are the optimal variable combinations? Okay, so if you have a big sort of overall topic for yours, you can just put that as your title and then put your name as by. And if you have a partner, you can put both of you. So as we started with the last presentation, we're going to do an introduction. Okay, so since my topic overall is about high intensity interval training, I'm going to start out the presentation on my first actual content slide by defining what high intensity interval training is, okay, and kind of talking about what the general view is on interval training, okay. So in high intensity interval training is a newer type of training that uses high intensity bouts of work with short bouts of rest, and those are done periodically or over and over again in order to accomplish a given amount of training time, okay? And it has been found to be safe and effective with most populations, okay? It has been shown by multiple researchers to increase aerobic power, or VO2 max, in healthy individuals. It has been shown to also have a beneficial impact on VO2 max with clinical populations or populations that have a chronic disease. And I have here listed multiple chronic diseases and clinical populations where there is existing research to show high intensity interval training can get a beneficial impact with those populations. Now, stepping aside real quick, notice here that I put in numbers. This is why I wanted you to number your references in your bibliography, because when you're citing those articles, you're just going to put the number in. I don't want you to put the name of the author in. I just want you to put the number corresponding to the number on the bibliography in the text as your reference, right? So just for example, my references number 28 and 29 are going to talk about this. My reference number 34 is going to talk specifically about patients with heart failure and how interval training was used with those patients. Same with diabetics, same with COPD, and same with obese and overweight populations. Okay, so insert the number. Now, carrying on with our introduction, not only can high-intensity interval training increase aerobic capacity in healthy and clinical populations, it can also be used as a very powerful tool to fight against obesity, okay? It has been found to be effective at reducing body fat stores, reducing skin fold thicknesses, and has also been shown to have a beneficial impact on insulin levels to a greater extent than steady-state exercise, okay? So, traditionally, steady-state exercise was thought to be the way to accomplish weight loss, but there is a lot of data now coming out that shows high-intensity interval training is also a viable option to use to combat obesity in overweight individuals, okay? And again, stepping aside real quick, my references here, 3, 31, and 30. They're going to point out the papers in my bibliography that address these topics here specifically, okay? I just want to tell you, when you're presenting your presentation to me via recording at the end of the term, you do not have to point out the numbers like I'm doing now. I'm just saying that just so you all understand how to structure your presentation. So, one more final benefit of high intensity interval training is that it has been argued that high intensity interval training can actually improve compliance with exercise. Okay, compliance is going to refer to the ability of people to stick with their program and to not give up and quit. Okay, often time is cited as a barrier to participation in exercise. People say they don't have time to do it. The benefit of high intensity interval training is it doesn't take as long. Okay, now there is a trade-off, as we see in this bullet point here. There is an inverse relationship between intensity and duration. So the harder you're working, the shorter the amount of time that you have to work, right? So if you have a barrier of time, you don't have time to exercise for 60 minutes, you can work out for 30 minutes, but you need to take your intensity up to a higher level, okay? So in conclusion, high intensity interval training does represent a time efficient way to improve cardiovascular fitness, the metabolic system, as well as the muscular systems. Okay, and as we showed previously, it can have a positive impact on body fat percentages, skin fold measurements, etc. Okay, so clearly there is a value for high intensity interval training, but there are some open questions. And here are my two big questions that I wanted to answer as I looked into the research about this topic. Okay, first, my first big question: what is the most effective mode to use while participating in HIIT? Okay, that will minimize orthopedic disruption. So let me just explain that really quickly. By mode, I mean, are you going to do it on the treadmill? Are you going to do it on the bike? Are you going to use free weights? Are you going to use a rowing machine? That's what I mean by mode. What is the mode of exercise? Okay. I also then want to consider minimizing orthopedic disruption. And what I mean by that is I don't want to have a lot of impact on the joints. Okay. Evidence suggests that running is the best activity for burning calories and improving cardiovascular fitness. However, running is a highly impactful activity on the joints, right? So there is a lot of orthopedic disruption with running. You're not going to have an obese person run because that would be too much weight pounding on their joints, right? So is there an effective mode that we can use other than running, essentially, is what I'm going to be looking at. Okay, that's my first question. Second question is, there's a lot of different ways that we could structure the variables of intensity, duration, rest period length. And I wanted to learn, is there an optimal way to set these variables during a HIIT session to maximize our benefits? Okay, so we're going to address that question second. So let's dive into question one. What is the most effective mode to use when doing HIIT training? Okay. Most of the research is going to look at the VO2 accomplished during a given activity, okay? And what they found is not a big surprise to me. Running and treadmill exercise was found to be more likely to get higher VO2 levels than cycling or swimming, okay? And the reason for that is running is a weight-bearing activity. Cycling and swimming are non-weight-bearing activities. When you're doing weight-bearing activity, there's going to be a greater amount of energy required and used by your body, okay? Specifically, cycling was found to produce about a 5 to 25% lower VO2 max value compared to treadmill exercise, depending upon the population. And again, it goes back to the weight-bearing activity. But also the fact that cycling is only a lower body activity where running uses upper body and lower body both. The more muscle mass that is involved, the greater the metabolic demand will be, the more calories you will burn, the more energy will be expended, okay? To back that up even further, arm ergometry, which is basically like using an arm bike, gets a 20 to 30% lower VO2 max compared to treadmill. Okay, so clearly, based upon these two bullet points, we need a full body exercise. If we really want to get the most out of our interval training, we need to use an exercise mode that uses both upper body and lower body. Okay, adding arm and leg work improves VO2 max by about 10%. Okay, there is the difference between passive versus active arm work. So with passive arm work, I'm talking about like when you're running, your arms are moving, but they're not really generating force. Where if you are on a rowing machine and you're pulling, you're actively generating force. Okay, so that could be a factor to explore. Okay, and we'll see if the literature available gives us any insight into that idea as we carry on to the next slide. I'm sorry. So, sub question: does active arm work matter? Now, this is an interesting picture. An old study actually added the arm ergometer to the bike to see if there was an increased VO2 max response. And what they found were that the VO2 max values between a treadmill and a dual drive bike were pretty similar. Okay, so that's actually a good thing. That shows that by simulating upper and lower body exercise on a cycle, we could get a similar response that we would get on a treadmill. So that could be a good non-weight bearing option for individuals who are obese, for example. Okay. Now there's another device which we'll see on the next slide that is known as the Versa Climber. Okay. The Versa Climber is again a full body device, and it uses both upper body and lower body in an active fashion. And what they found were that the VO2 max values were not significantly different between the treadmill and the Versa Climber. Okay. But the heart rate values were. Okay. So this is again showing that potentially using a device such as the Versa Climber could produce similar energy expenditure to a treadmill and would again represent a good non-weight bearing option. Okay. Now, on the flip side, I mentioned the rowing ergometer as a potential tool on a few minutes ago. Two studies I found did not find a similar or significant differences between cycling and rowing, indicate that rowing does not achieve the level of energy expenditure that treadmill does. It's more on the level of cycling. So these couple studies that I have listed here seem to rule out using the row ergometer as a tool for maximizing energy expenditure during HIIT training. Just to go on to some more information about the mode. The Versa Climber was found by another study to get higher VO2 max values than, the treadmill or rowing. Okay. And then a second group, Seals and Mullen, found significantly higher VO2 max values using the dual drive cycle ergometer versus a treadmill, only when people were already upper body trained. Okay, so what that is saying is if somebody is not trained in their upper body is not going to contribute much to finding these higher VO2 max values. However, some athletes who are upper body trained, such as swimmers, because they use their upper body in an active fashion when they swim, they would actually achieve these higher VO2 max values. Okay. So that was all studies looking at VO2 max values. Another variable, that I wanted to look at was energy expenditure. Is energy expenditure affected by these different modes? The research was pretty inconclusive. Now notice, stepping aside real quick, this is how I worded it. Evidence is less clear regarding. So that means if you have conflicting research, which you will probably find, which is okay, that's a way that you can verbalize it. Evidence is less clear, meaning that you had some studies that said this and you had some studies that said the opposite. And again, that's okay. You want to present both sides of the argument, okay? Because only through that, presenting both sides of the argument, can you start to find the true answer. If you're only looking at one side of the argument, then you're never, ever going to arrive at the true answer because you're only getting a very one-sided approach, okay? Remember that in life as well as school. Okay, moving on. Back to in the presentation. So energy expenditure was found to be similar between all of these different modes. So that does not give us much to go on there at all. Here we see energy expenditure was higher with treadmill versus another device, which is full body cross-country ski simulator, okay, or other machines that are lower body only. So again, evidence is inconclusive here, okay. One study showing that treadmill is better did find that treadmill was superior to other indoor exercise machines in terms of energy expenditure. Okay, so even though the evidence was less than clear, this tends to show that, as I mentioned earlier, treadmill is the most efficient at producing high levels of energy expenditure. But again, we're trying to find an alternative other than the treadmill. So if I think about it in that perspective, this study shows that a cross-country ski machine found similar energy expenditures to treadmill, which tells me that using a dynamic upper and lower body exercise machine could be our best option. A final variable that they looked at for energy expenditure was time to exhaustion. Okay, so one study found time to exhaustion was similar between swimming, running, rowing, and cycling. Okay, so again, no difference was noted there. So that doesn't give us a whole lot of information to look at. Okay, here we see rowing and cycling. Cycling lower body only. Rowing is upper and lower body. There was not much difference between heart rate and lactate responses. Okay, so rowing does not seem to produce enough of metabolic disruption to achieve the level of what running can do for us. And it's pretty similar to cycling. And then finally, lactate and ventilation were found to be lower in swimming versus other modes of exercise. Swimming could be a good option, but because you're floating in water, you're not bearing your weight at all. That really lowers the metabolic demand. Okay, so swimming does not seem to be the best option. We could rule that one out when it comes to maximal use of high intensity interval training. So what were the conclusions regarding the mode? Okay, most of the evidence does support that running is the best option. Okay, however, we were looking at trying to find an option other than running. Okay, so there wasn't a super clear answer. Okay, but it does show us that if we could find a tool, a mode, an exercise machine where we would combine lower body and upper body exercise in some sort of a non-impact option, that would get us as closest to running as we could without actually doing that. Okay, so I mentioned earlier the Versa Climber, a cross-country ski machine. Those would be my top two choices. Those are not as available as maybe a row ergometer. We saw clearly that rowing ergometry is down the list a little bit. However, that could be the best option that you have available, right? It's kind of all about choosing the best option you have available to you. If you have a rower and a cycle available, the rower would be better because there is some sort of an upper body contribution because you're pulling on that, I don't know what you would call that, the chain to generate the force, okay? I did want to back up because I had a picture of a Versa Climber somewhere and I don't see it. I wanted to show you all what that, oh, actually here it is right here. So that was actually the very next slide. Other conclusions. Treadmill work is optimal, but what else can we look at? We want something with arm work. Cycling does not include arm work. So there are actually bikes that have arm work. One such bike is the Airdyne. Now, when I thought of this presentation, I wanted to find research on the Airdyne because I bought an Airdyne and we use them in our labs as well, and they're really hard. The bad news is there's not much research on the Airdyne at all. Okay, so that could be like a future research direction, is doing some research on the Airdyne to see if there is enough evidence to support it would be a good alternative to treadmill because it is a full body activity. Okay. Now there was more research on the Versa Climber, but still not very much at all. This is the Versa Climber. It's kind of an active climbing device. The few studies that were in existence actually found the Versa Climber to be pretty similar to the treadmill in terms of VO2 and energy expenditure. So if you had a Versa Climber available, that would be a great choice. Versa Climbers are typically not available in gym settings, so that can be eliminated. Airdynes, they are actually usually found in gyms, okay? Row ergometers are becoming more common. So if I had to rank them in terms of order, I would go VersaClimber 1, Airdyne 2, row ergometer 3, and then I would get into like cycles. Okay. With, again, remembering treadmill is number 1 for sure, but we were looking for a non-impact alternative, something other than running. Okay, so I'm going to take a breath, and now we're going to transition to our question 2. This one was addressing the training variables, okay? So the first variable I'm going to look at was intensity. What is the intensity that has to be used in order to really maximize the benefits of high intensity interval training, okay? Of course, 100% intensity would work, but do we have to go all out every time, okay? Now, what they, a variable that kept showing up in these papers that I found was the Pmax, and what that refers to is what is the peak power output at somebody's VO2 max, okay? And so what some studies found was that a Pmax of at least 75% was required to achieve benefits, okay? Other studies found that you had to actually do the full Pmax. Hit at the Pmax was required to significantly improve the time trials, okay? So essentially what that shows us is in order to really get the benefits of HIIT training, it has to be somewhere between 75% and 100% of the Pmax. Or in other words, how fast would you be running at your VO2 max? How fast would you be cycling at your VO2 max? That's the value that one should really be working at, okay? Now, with unfit populations, that might be difficult to do. It's going to be very unpleasant for them. It's also could be potentially, dangerous. So they recommend for clinical populations staying above 100% and going more like the 85 to 90% of the Pmax. Okay, so keeping them under their maximal level of exertion slightly is going to be recommended for the clinical populations. Okay, so the conclusion is the work interval should be at or close to the level that is identified as the Pmax, or that means the power output at one's VO2 max. Second variable is the duration. How long does your work interval need to be? Okay. Now this one is surprising to me. It makes interval training sound really difficult. Okay. So this study here looked at different sports, and what they found was that the interval length varied based upon the activity. Okay. So for all-out running, 50 seconds is effective. Now that's kind of a long time to run as fast as you can. For cycling, 70 seconds was found to be effective. Again, cycling for 1 minute and 10 seconds all out sounds pretty hard. And then swimming, 90 seconds, right? So why is there such a big difference here? Well, it's the weight bearing idea, right? When you're bearing your weight, you're using more energy. In the pool, you're not bearing your weight at all, so less energy is burned, so you need to go for a longer period of time. Okay. Another way that this was looked at was using another variable that they referred to as the Tmax, which is time to exhaustion at your Pmax. Okay. So how long do I need to go before I'm exhausted? And the conclusion that a few different papers found was that the work interval should be a time equivalent to 60 to 70% of your time to exhaustion. So to put that into context, if it takes me 2 minutes of all-out running to be exhausted, 75% of that time would be 90 seconds. Okay, so 60% of that time would be what? About 75 seconds. Okay, so what that's telling me is if my time to exhaustion is 2 minutes, then in order to effectively do interval training, I need to exercise at 60 to 75 seconds because my time to exhaustion is 90 seconds. Okay. And these different research studies essentially find the same thing. So somewhere between 60 to 75% of your time to exhaustion, that is how long your work interval should be, okay? And honestly, that matches up pretty well with what we see here. Now, there was a little bit of conflicting research. Again, it's always good to report that. Not everybody's going to agree on everything, and that's fine. They did not find that 60% Tmax was long enough for cyclists, indicating that beyond that. So that might push us up into that 75%, like we mentioned earlier. Now, for the clinical population, that would be a huge challenge. That's going to be too long. So there were some studies that looked at the clinical population, and they found that a significantly shorter work interval was effective with those populations, as low as 30 seconds and not over 90 seconds. So somewhere in this range here would be recommended. So what I would do, of course, is start on the low end. If you have a new client who's in a clinical population, start at 30 seconds. And then slowly, as their fitness level progresses, you would increase the duration. Okay, so somewhere in this range is recommended, but I would always recommend starting at the low end of the range, especially with the clinical population. This is an interesting bullet point. They were looking at enjoyability of the activity. So, of course, if you're working all out, 30 seconds is more enjoyable than 120 seconds. Well, no kidding, right? 120 seconds of pain, 30 seconds of pain is much more enjoyable than 2 minutes of pain. So the conclusion was that the longer intervals are more appropriate for trained populations. So again, in that kind of like 60 to 75 second range, where the shorter intervals are more appropriate for the untrained or the clinical population, being in the 30 to 60 second range. Third variable is rest interval length. So we saw how long we have to work. Now the answer is how long do we have to recover? First of all, it has been found that an active recovery is going to be more effective in a trained population. Okay. An active recovery is defined at, continuing to move at a low intensity corresponding to 30 to 40% of one's VO2 max. Okay. Now for the clinical populations, what they found is an active recovery actually is still too intense to promote drops in these variables. Okay, so for a clinical population, they actually recommend a passive recovery from the work interval to allow for more effective recovery. So that's a big difference there. Okay, active recovery for fit individuals, passive recovery for clinical and untrained individuals. Okay. Now, in terms of the length of the interval, there was not data available to give me any information. Instead, what I sort of pieced together from some different research is that the more fit you are, the less time you need to recover. The less fit you are, the more time you need to recover. So in order to assess recovery, what we should look at is how rapidly the heart rate drops, okay? So you should measure heart rate during interval training, and during the recovery, you're going to monitor heart rate, and once you see their heart rate drop to 50 to 65% of their age predicted max heart rate, then it's going to be time to start the next work interval. Okay. Now, as I said earlier, a fit person is going to recover faster. A less fit person will recover slower, but that makes sense, right? A fit person can get in more work than an unfit person. So as somebody becomes more fit, they will recover faster. Therefore, you can do more work. Okay. So monitoring heart rate, looking for a reduction into this zone will tell you that your client is ready to work hard again. Okay. Now, for clinical populations, it's a little bit different. They're looking for heart rate to drop by at least 22 beats per minute in a 2-minute time period. Once that has been accomplished, they will be ready to do the next work bout. Okay. So final conclusions. So here I'm going to basically synthesize answers from my 2 big questions. From question 1, we found that arm work should be included with leg work if possible. Okay. but we need to pay attention to the level of impact. For healthy, fit individuals at an ideal body weight who are runners, running is going to be the best option. If you have a client where running is not appropriate, if they're obese, unfit, they have a injury aggravated by weight-bearing activity, then we would want to find another mode that incorporates arm activity, such as the VersaClimber, the Airdyne cycle, or the row ergometer. Okay. Jumping into question 2, for our intensity, it should be essentially all out during your work interval, to put it simply. The length of your interval should be somewhere between 60 to 70% of the Tmax, and that corresponded to around 50 to 75 seconds in length. For clinical or untrained populations, we need to go lower than that, 30 to 60 seconds. Always starting on the low end and working your way up as their fitness level improves. And then lastly, for your rest intervals, for fit populations, the recovery should be active. And they should see a drop to this heart rate zone. For your clinical or unfit populations, the recovery should be passive, and we should see a drop of at least 22 beats per minute, and then they will be ready to go on to their next work interval. Future direction, as I said, there was not a lot of research on the VersaClimber or the Airdyne, so those could be valuable tools. There's just not a lot of research found on them. An arc trainer refers to like an elliptical machine. Again, there's not a lot of research on ellipticals either. Could we achieve a Pmax on one of these devices? If so, then that could show it to be a suitable replacement for the treadmill. Okay. And then finally, there was not a lot of research on the rest interval duration. I had to sort of piece that together from just exercise physiology textbooks. That seems to be the recommended zone for recovery for heart rate. So that's what I went with, because there was not a lot of research on rest intervals. So that could be a future direction there. Then lastly, these variables were not touched on at all in research. There was no research about the cadence or the rate. So think about that. Like if you're cycling, how fast do you need to be cycling? There wasn't any information about that. The range of motion, is working the muscle through a full range of motion or is a partial range of motion better? There was not any information about that either. So those could be future directions for research as well. Okay. And here is my bibliography. So stepping aside real quick, your last slides, I want you to offer final conclusions, looking at both of your 2 questions. And then if you found there was any information lacking from what you located, you should have a future direction slide, right? So as I mentioned, there wasn't much research on these tools, so this could be an avenue for future researchers to go in. Okay? Try to find a couple bullet points to include regarding future direction for your presentation. And then your last slide should be your bibliography. I just did a screenshot of mine, so feel free to do that as well. You don't have to necessarily type it all in. I had a ton of sources at 35 because honestly, I wrote a paper on this and submitted it to get it published, and it was rejected, unfortunately. So that's why I have so many sources, but I was able to use the work I did and convert it into a presentation as well. It was rejected for a few reasons. They suggested alternatives for us, edits we could make to get it published, but we kind of just let it go to move on to new projects. So that's it for my presentation. Mine was longer. I'm at 33 minutes now, and I had probably more slides than yours. Yours does not need to be as long, and I would not expect you to talk as long as this either. Yours can be in that anywhere from 10 to 15 minute range. Okay. If you're working with a partner, what you could do is you could maybe alternate slides, or you could, one of you take one section, say one of you do question 1, one of you do question 2, just kind of split it up so you each talk an equal amount, roughly an equal amount. Okay. So that's it. Questions, send them to me and I will answer them as fast as I possibly can. You all have an excellent day. Talk to you soon. Goodbye.